Hello, and welcome to this special Storytime series, Wayside by the Fireside, with me, your host, Mike. During this special Storytime, we will be reading the book Sideways Stories from Wayside School. It's a fascinating book with many chapters about many students that all go to school in this wild building called Wayside School. Let's read, shall we? Introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it was built 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to the class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. 30th and 13th look the same to me. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly, and that's probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. And that is probably also true. Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. For reference, here is a picture of Mrs. Gorf. There's only 1 picture per chapter in this book, so you'll have to use your imagination, which I'm sure is wild at this point. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointy ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught class on the 30th story.
If you children are bad,
she warned,
or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples.
Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John, and these are students in Mrs. Gorf's class. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Miss Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple.
Does anybody else have an opinion?
For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared to tell even their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Miss Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. And their parents were worried. They didn't know where the children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, and then stuck out her tongue and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of the chair. Apple. Marisa tried to run away. She was halfway to the door when Miss Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, her left ear began to wiggle. And when Marisa opened the door and had one foot out, Miss Gorf stuck out her tongue, turned her into an apple. Miss Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. And then, a funny thing happened. Miss Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed and they were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrace, Maricia, and the three Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Miss Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Miss Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Miss Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy.
Now I can go home,
she said.
I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again.
You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her.
Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce.
But the apples didn't stop. Miss Gorf could do nothing about it.
Turn us back into children,
Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, and then her right, and turned all the apples back into children. All right, said Maricia, let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do.
No,
screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, but Jenny held up a mirror. Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher, and even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. A common affliction here. Lewis, the art teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Lewis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. And that was chapter 1 about Mrs. Gorf, the meanest apple ever.